Hello, everyone, both in the room and online. It's my pleasure to welcome you here to this brown bag. I'm Jamie Goodrich, the director of the Humanities Center. Today, we have a presentation by Renee Hoogland, who is a professor of English, literature, and culture here at Wayne State, and the author of 3 monographs, Elizabeth Bowen, A Reputation in Writing, which was published in 1994, Lesbian Configurations, which was published in 1997, and A Violent Embrace, Art and Aesthetics After Representation, which was published in 2014. She has published 49 articles and book chapters.
I know, I counted them once.
That's amazing. Served and will soon serve again as the editor of Criticism, a quarterly for literature and the arts, and as the senior editor-in-chief of 10 interdisciplinary handbooks on gender. She's currently working on a monograph titled The Other Side of Nowhere, Contemporary Photography as Practice of Life, and as the editor of a collection of essays, The Analog Revisited, Questioning the Technical Image in a Digital Age. Both of these are under contract with Vernon Press. And we all know her legendary amount of service to the department and to the college and to the university. She has served and continues to serve on too many committees across the university for me to name, but she considers her membership of the Policy Committee of the Academic Senate, of which she serves as the vice chair, as perhaps the most significant. I know we're all grateful to her for the work that she does in that capacity.
Thank you.
So today her talk is entitled Fugitive Sites/Sites, Cynthia Greig's Digital Transformations of Art Space. And I'll let her go ahead and take it away.
All right, go ahead to the first slide. Can you put it in presentation mode? Yes, excellent. The first slide. So yeah, the title of this paper is Fugitive Sites/Sites. As a post-structuralist and deconstructionist, I still love these diacritical markings and little kind of quasi-intellectual games with words. Cynthia Greig's Digital Transformations of Art Space. This is a talk I gave a couple of weeks ago, I think 3 weeks ago in Seattle, at the annual conference of the Association for the Study of Arts of the Present. And I thought it would be fun to kind of give it today and kind of get your feedback on it. And the paper starts with a quotation from Sigrid Nunez's novel, The Friend, published in 2010. In the end, writing and photography probably destroy more of the past than they will ever preserve it. Next slide, please. Can you do it in presentation mode so that we don't see the other slides? Next slide. Yes, thank you. I'm looking at a winter landscape opening up to the horizon. While bright, the light has disappeared from the sky, hidden behind a solid mass of clouds on one of those days just after Christmas, when the world seems to be standing still for a moment, expanding into the massive space of sky, brilliant but opaque. In the foreground, a surface stretches to meet the deceptive demarcation line between Earth and space that, according to family lore, provoked me at age 4 on a day at the beach to observe to my mother. In the distance, the sky is lying on the ground. The image not only reminds me of, but reactivates this early perception. The stretch of land ground, brownish gray, with several greenish patches cutting across the slightly curved ridges that mark its surface, positions me in a landscape that feels familiar, that enfolds me, that I can almost smell, even though the surf line is too far away to make me hear more than a slight buzz, behind which I assume the crashing waves to be. The label attached to the wall under the work, which is clearly a photograph, but because of its textured quality of its subject, also evokes the tactility of paintings, reads Matthew Marks, Bryce Martin, New Paintings, and therewith begins to confuse my perceptual experience. The image described is part of the series Gallery Horizons, a set of digital 14.5 by 22 inches photographs by Michigan artist Cynthia Greig. Next slide, please.
Actually, can we give 1 second? The chat saying that you're only seeing the first slide. Let's double check that they can see it.
Wow. And then the next one.
Oh,
Thank you.
good to go.
Walking through the exhibition, looking at the other works in the series and pondering the labels, all including the name of a gallery, an artist, and the title of their show, it gradually dawns on me that I'm not actually looking at landscapes. The exhibition notes explain that gallery horizons consists of close-ups of the space where the floor of a particular gallery wall meets the wall. Each work constitutes a material visualization of typically invisible spaces that are digitally transformed, abstracted to horizon lines, creating space and thus actualizing deep landscapes that emerge only in a perceptual encounter, in the event of looking as it turned out elsewhere into imaginary depths. A second related series of Greig's recent work equally plays havoc with and therewith confuses conventional practices of looking inside the contemporary art gallery. Titled Threshold, these large-scale, they're 26.5 by 40 inches, color prints pull me into long shot views of gallery spaces in which the walls are startlingly empty. The artworks have been digitally erased. Foregrounding the typical cubist architectural style of the contemporary art gallery, high ceilings, straight angles, pristine white walls, and shiny gray concrete floors in which traces of the erased artworks occasionally appear reflected. The photographic image contains no artwork, but people, alone or in smaller groups or larger groups, seen from the back, dwarfed by the cavernous gallery space. Looking at empty walls, ostensibly unaware of the fact that they are being transformed from subjects into the objects of my look, from lookers into that which is being looked at. These photographs do not merely throw the subject-object relation of the gaze into disarray. They also deliberately problematize the act of looking in relation to art in its dedicated spaces, and therewith raises the question of aesthetic perception per se, a question I believe to be central to the complexities of the photographic image in the wake of the digital turn. Gallery Horizons and Threshold are both unabashedly digital projects. Greig's determined attempts to, quote, dislocate the viewer, end quote, to disorganize any straightforward, historically naturalized single point of view by, quote, exposing the unexpected forces of entropy that operate beneath the art intended to be our focus, end quote, forced me to, and I quote Greig again, mediate on the idea of nothingness, end quote, is at once expressed in and denied by these photographs. While not exactly engaging me in what I've elsewhere called the violent embrace of the involuntary forces of certain artworks, Greig's work is at once entrancing and cerebral, not the most theatrical kind of art so forcefully dismissed by art historian Michael Freed. The photographs nonetheless pull me into an embrace that involves at once feeling and thought, both sensation and reflection. They not only stage an aesthetic encounter, but also force contemplation about the nature of such encounters within the architectural conventions of the white cube itself. By reorganizing the relationship between the subject and object of artistic visuality, both series alter the field of aesthetic perception as such. And in the context of this seminar, it was part of a seminar this paper, they invite me to explore ways in which the digital image actualizes visibility where none was before, in particular in the realm of aesthetic production and its reception, in the domain of art in its wielding functions. At first glance, the photographs next slide, please, in Threshold appear to literalize what the founder of object-oriented ontology, or OOO, Graham Harman, suggests to be the essential quality of artworks generally, assuming aesthetics to mean, quote, the general theory of how objects differ from their own qualities, end quote. Harman defines beauty as, quote, the disappearance of a real object behind its sensual qualities, end quote. Rejecting concentral distribution of between phenomena and noumena, also known as appearances and the thing in itself, as well as any phenomenological approach ensuing from it, OOO reaffirms the thing in itself as not only, quote, the key to future progress in philosophy, but also as the basis on which aesthetics establishes itself as first philosophy. In his recent book on art and objects, Harman develops this idea by first claiming that an artwork is defined by the fact that it, quote, cannot primarily be a form of knowledge, end quote, and while potentially generating a cognitive activity as a kind of side effect, is therefore in the final instance, quote unquote, unparaphrasable. Knowledge statements are literal statements, and literal statements treat objects as interchangeable with a list of qualities it possesses, Harman argues. Artworks, sensual objects with real qualities, contain non-literal elements, which is what qualifies them as art. Describing their physical composition does not tell us much about such objects' operations qua art, but neither do artworks rely on some vague form of aestheticism. In order for aesthetic effects to be created by a work of art, and hence for beauty to emerge, the real, non-literal object, Harman writes, must withdraw, disappear from the literal level, without therewith becoming inaccessible. The disappearance of the real object behind its sensual qualities is that which Fried dismisses as a theatrical effect, but which Harman identifies as the conditional quality of art. This effect, he argues, cannot be approached directly, but can be quote-unquote alluded to. The artwork then, not being a form of knowledge yet real, both as a thing in itself and in terms of its sensual qualities, quote, needs to be approached from the side rather than head-on, Hartman concludes. In literally erasing the artworks from the gallery walls and threshold, Greig gives material form to what Harman calls the withdrawn object that generates the theatrical effect of aesthetic experience. The photographs explicitly identify artworks being removed from the gallery walls as the site where the fugitive, inscrutable real object is hiding behind its sensual qualities and is supposed to become accessible, albeit obliquely. At the same time, they set in motion a reversal of the traditional visual mise en abîme. The empty white space of the walls, a space of literal absence, where we expect the artworks in the gallery to appear, is turned into a space of presence by and for the act of looking. Not only the looks of the faceless figures, expectantly looking up and down the walls, but also our own looks as beholders of the photographs. On the literal level, the gaping white walls, digitally enhanced to retain the texture and detail of the actual gallery walls, lure us into the position of the viewer, beholding those who are looking at materialized absence. Our gaze seems to be redirected from the invisible objects of the look, the artworks, to the subjects of this type of institutionalized looking. Yet we do not actually see these looks, nor the subject's eyes. Instead of, as I've suggested, turning the subjects in the photographs, the people in the gallery spaces, into the objects of our gaze, the function of each photograph in this series is, in the terms of O, to draw us to the withdrawn object, the inscrutable object of the photograph, the object in itself that it at once creates and obscures, and that, Harman insists, forms the act of aesthetic experience as such. Still, since the object cannot be separated from its qualities, they always come as a pair, Harman aptly observes, something needs to be left or happening in its wake. In a quite remarkable move in view of his firm dismissal of Deleuzian notions of process, becoming, the virtual, and the event in his earlier work, Harman in Art and Objects, published in 2020, puts the beholder of the artwork in this place. Whereas Kantian aesthetics situates beauty exclusively in the eye of the beholder, O rejects the opposition between the subject and object of the aesthetic act and insists on the beholder as, quote, the real object that performs and sustains, end quote, the artwork's qualities once they are stripped from its actual object, while nonetheless insisting that, quote, oops, this is what I do with my double, sorry, should not use both sides of your paper. I'll read that sentence again. Whereas Kantian aesthetics situates beauty exclusively in the eye of the beholder, O rejects the opposition between subject and object of the aesthetic act and insists on the beholder as, quote, the real object that performs and sustains, end quote, the artwork's qualities once they are stripped from the actual object, while nonetheless insisting that each of the terms has an autonomous reality not exhausted by its relation to the other, end quote. Simply put, artwork exists only as a hybrid of work and beholder, and it is as a new object that this hybrid persists. Harman here appears to come very close to what Deleuze calls the aesthetic encounter, but for the fact that the object-oriented philosopher draws a near clear distinction between the human being as, quote, an ingredient of art, and as a privileged beholder of it. End quote. The new object, which like Deleuze he defines as a compound, is more than the sum of its parts. Quote, it exceeds both parts individually and is not exhaustively knowable by the human beholder who forms part of it, end quote, and therefore cannot be defined in terms of what it does, but must be understood as an object, as what it is. While I consider Triple O's theory of aesthetics overall persuasive, I find myself struggling with the latter idea on several grounds. First, Harman's denial of any kind of doing to the aesthetic act appears to contradict his own invocation of the beholder as someone who comes to quote unquote stand in for the real object that disappears from our grasp, end quote. In fact, it is the very participation of the beholder in a work of art that leads him to the conclusion that there is a primordial theatricality to all the arts. Moreover, even if the unified reality of the work-beholder hybrid cannot be said to be, quote, exhausted by any particular understanding of it, end quote, this does not in any way mean that the work itself is not also doing something, that is to say, in calling forth the viewer, upon whose active theatrical participation it depends. And thirdly, Harman's theory of art in terms of withdrawn or inscrutable objects that disappear from our perception paradoxically appears to entail that the being of the object as such is not so much obscured as it turns into a logical impossibility. Indeed, as German philosopher Marcus Gabriel argues in his short book, The Power of Art, published in 2018, in which he outlines a new aesthetic realism, Triple O's notion of the withdrawn object means that, quote, aesthetics can never put us in touch with art as it really is, or as art in itself, end quote. In other words, Gabriel continues, the object's disappearing act renders art itself into something that is, quote, not really part of reality, but only a scene celebrating our alleged incapacity to perceive things as they are, end quote. While I cannot do justice to his argument here, I want to take up the challenge of Gabriel's new realist model of art, especially the notion of fields of sense, in order to gesture towards a possible approach and to return to the enigmatic, fugitive abstraction of Greig's series Gallery Horizons. Gabriel starts from the assumption that, quote, we can perceive objects because we exist in the same domain, or in what he terms the same field of sense. Fields of sense are an ensemble of objects which appear in a certain manner. Or alternatively, quote, the places in which everything appears, end quote. Since reality itself is infinitely complex, that is to say, since the combinations of objects are infinite, the ways in which we perceive them are infinite as well. Moreover, not every field of sense is the result of human activity, as is the case, for instance, with galaxies or elementary particles. What this means, Gabriel maintained, is that we, quote, cannot sort reality into mind on one side and the world on the other, end quote, but must accept that the mind is, quote, actively involved in reality. Accordingly, there's no such thing as an external reality. There is no world out there, as Kant postulates, without spectators, nor can we consider ourselves as beings outside of perceptual reality. Gabriel hence rejects the phenomenological model of perception, subject versus object, mind versus world, to posit a three-way relation of perception that holds between ourselves and an object, but that also adds another dimension to reality, which is the form of the relation. It is his three-dimensional model of perception that supports his overall claim to the structural ontological power of art. The supposition underlying Gabriel's new aesthetic realism is that humans are set apart from other animals because we, quote, can come up with theories of the universe, end quote. He therewith reserves a central space in reality for the imagination. Imagination, he writes, is not a nothingness, nor does it transcend reality in any way. On the contrary, since what we imagine is real to the extent that we imagine it, imagination is a compartment of reality. Aesthetic experience activated by art and the dreams and reveries it evokes are therefore as real as it gets. They add rather than take anything away from reality. And whatever takes hold of our imagination, Gabriel boldly proclaims, has absolute power over us. The power of art on our aesthetic experience cannot be explained by the Kantian tradition of thought, which in this respect is sustained by Triple O, because it is based on the idea that the artwork or real object withdraws from our perception. Since artworks are, in fact, found in reality, Gabriel continues, and since, quote, human perception does not look onto reality from elsewhere, end quote, it is precisely the co-presence of work and beholder in the same domain or field of sense that allows for aesthetic experience in the first place. To be sure, we do not perceive artworks in the same way that we do ordinary objects. As ideas expressed in material, artworks form a combination of three elements: the material, its shape, and the idea expressed. As such, they are unequivocally different from, say, a table or my doorbell, to which I stand in a different perceptual relation. Art makes me feel as much as it makes me think, thought that is not necessarily conceptual, and what I perceive and what I think is not external to the aesthetic experience. These activities are part of the artwork itself. To the extent that art makes us think, the artwork is a realization of a composition that is itself non-material. Artworks, Gabriel concludes, thus, quote, differ categorically from ordinary objects in that they enter into the relation of perception in such a way that they perceive themselves. This somewhat puzzling claim is based on the assumption that in the three-way perceptual relation, the object of perception has, quote, the property of standing in the relation of being perceived, end quote, which is a real event, not something imaginary arising in disembodied minds. As compositions that are, quote, organized by an idea which unites a diversity of sensory elements, end quote. The artwork, quote, utilizes our nervous system and our mind in order to realize itself. It is thus by way of our aesthetic experience of them that artworks relate to themselves within the overlapping fields of sense that constitute the perceptual relation in the aesthetic act. This relation is not external to reality, but is itself part of reality. Recalling Fried's and Harman's invocation of the notion of theatricality in the aesthetic act, Gabriel defines this real event in terms of performance as a performative act that, quote, essentially encompasses the relation of thinking between us and the work. Gabriel's new aesthetic realist model resolves some of the problems I ran into with Triple O's theory of aesthetics. First, by positing the aesthetic act in the context of a three-way perceptual relation in overlapping fields of sense, it avoids reducing artworks to objects, which turns them into mysterious and unintelligible forces, as Gabriel puts it, whose essence escapes us. The latter idea, fundamental to Triple, runs counter to the fact that art does things in the world, is found in a reality which is not only is capable of enriching, but in which it also has been and continues to be considered a force to be reckoned with. The long history of book burnings and the destruction of sculptures, paintings, and other forms of so-called inappropriate art is merely one fact that attests to this truth. Second, whereas Gabriel's claim that artworks do not exist without interpretation, that without interpretation artworks would be mere objects or random artifacts, might appear to approach Harman's foregrounding of the beholder in the aesthetic act, the opposite is true. In Triple O, we recall, the beholder comes to stand in for the object that withdraws. In new aesthetic realism, in contrast, the object, in this case, both the material art object and its non-material composition in perceptual relation with the viewer, does not only not disappear, but instead exists in reality, while also adding to this reality by operating in its intrinsic field rather than in an external relation to it. As singular compositions of fields of sense, artworks are essentially interpretation dependent, Gabriel argues, but such interpretations cannot be anticipated or controlled by the artist, nor is the composition of an artwork ultimately completable. As long as there is aesthetic engagement with an artwork, it continues to be realized, gives rise to new or changing feelings and thoughts in beholders, and therewith continues to think itself. At the same time, there is no art without sensibility, for artworks rely on realities we can only perceive. Next slide, please. Gallery horizons confuse and problematize the relation between what I perceive, the photographic surface, its subject, the meeting point between floor and wall, and the imaginary realities that are generated in the perceptual illusion of the landscape that realizes itself in my thoughts and feelings, in the actual aesthetic experience. Recall furthermore that my first encounter with the work Matthew Marks, Bryce Martin, New Paintings, immediately called to mind an early perception of the relation between sky and sea, between airspace and ground. That's adding another layer to the perceptual reality of the floor, wall, deep landscape composition. Instead of becoming inscrutable behind its sensory qualities, as does the real object in Harman's account of the aesthetic act, the form of the perceptual relation as proposed by Gabriel adds a dimension to reality, enriches it by creating layers of actual and imaginary perception that do not exceed or transcend the object of perception, but rather converge in a composition that is both real and concrete, intrinsic to the reality in which the artwork and I coexist in a shared field of sense. Instead of erasing the so-called traits of the real or turning the perceptual world into a nihilist simulacrum, the digital art photographs that provoke these thoughts give rise to an aesthetic experience from which the real object has not so much disappeared, nor in which I come to stand in for it, but in which the three elements of the artistic composition converge. The artwork performs itself, as Gabriel puts it, on the stage of my mind. By participating in it, the artwork seizes hold of me, I become part of it, and I cannot escape it. By situating these sites of perception in actual art spaces, Greig's work at once reinscribes the function of such spaces for concrete and singular practices of looking, and transforms them from within, thus adding yet another layer to an already multiple perceptual reality. Such then is the work of the artwork in its incompletability generally, but more especially perhaps also the work of the digital photograph that shows us something about photography per se, whether analog or digital. That is to say that it was never its function, to recall Sigrid Nunez's words with which I began, to either preserve or destroy the past, but instead, by actualizing visibility where none was before, to add to our present reality in all of its infinite complexity. Thank you.
Yeah. So we will open it up to questions both from the room and also from the Zoom room.
The Zoom room.
The Zoom room. Ariel, do you want to change it so that we can see who's in the room? Thanks.
I know it was a little bit of a theoretical exercise that I did here, but I hope that some of it kind of was clear while looking at the photographs.
I wasn't expecting so much theory. I will say, Renee, on a Friday afternoon. You
Well,
got me.
But you began your opening was a kind of a drastic description of the
Yes.
experience of the landscape. Just
Yeah.
something that actually in creative writing, we have students do. And maybe I'm curious about how you like just your own thinking, I'm thinking about you as a writer in this moment.
Right.
Like what was your thinking behind that as an entrance into the paper?
Well, that's actually a good question, and it's a large question because it took me a couple of books before I was willing to put myself in my writing in this way, because it is a form of creative nonfiction that I'm doing there. But I love ekphrases. I mean, I really love to engage with words as I perceive them and then see where that takes me. I mean, Foucault is a great proponent of it, and I learned from him. And since I started writing about art, and I don't know anything about art, I wasn't trained as an art historian or an artist, but I started to dabble in kind of like art philosophy and work with art because like I was kind of forced into writing about art by my ex-partner who asked me once to write catalog copy for a series of work for a show. And I said, okay, can we talk about the work? And she said, sure, we can talk about the work. And then a week later, I said, okay, can we talk about the work now? Like, no, I have to peel potatoes now. And some point she said, the deadline is tomorrow. I'm like, oh my God. So I gather we're not going to talk about the work. And she said, no, we're not going to talk about the work. So kind of she threw me into thinking about art in such a way that I could possibly also write about it, but just throw me in the deep end, right? Just kind of like seeing what I could think of, like what happens to me. So it's very self-reflective in that sense. Like what happens to me when I look at a work of art, and how can I abstract from that experience and kind of touch upon like theoretical models of thinking about art that interest me. And whether they actually fit, whether they actually kind of work for me or not. So it's kind of a mundane process, but it's very exciting. I mean, it makes me want to write about art because I've learned to trust myself a little bit, and I have some interesting things to say about what I look at. And it's very clear that there's art that I love, but that I would never write about it. But there is also art that kind of like, no, this is work that I want to write about. And like, I don't know how that decision happens, but I have like tons and tons of art books, you know, beautiful work that I love to look at, but I don't feel inclined to write about it. And I think when work disturbs me a little bit, when it confuses me, when I don't quite know what to do with it, then I'm interested in kind of, okay, and I probably need to write about it. And this is always the way I've written, like when I don't understand something, I use writing to kind of try and think things that I don't know how to think yet. And so that's basically how that whole process works. But then I'm also a theorist at heart. I love critical theory. And so I really kind of work with ideas and try to kind of bounce off ideas against one another. So yeah, I mean, but I've allowed myself to be more and more, actually from a violent embrace onwards, to write more and more from also like my own subjective position in as an art viewer and as a kind of the way I kind of respond and like why does and it's an interesting question, right? Why some works of art really kind of affect you and make you want to think more, and other works are just great to look at and then you're okay with that. It's like, so it's an interesting process. But yes, I'm a dabbler in lots of things as an originally literary scholar.
I see Elena has her hand up online.
Oh.
So we'll go to her next.
Hello, Elena.
Hi, Renee. Hello, fellow dabbler. And I feel the same way about films, compelled to write about some and not about others, and they're not always the ones that I love, so I like that comment. I was just wondering if you would say more about, so I was really interested in the in-betweenness of the sort of emergence of the work of art and that relationship between the beholder and the work itself. And I was thinking about the way that then places an interesting question of time in the balance of when the work of art is, of when it emerges and how many of them there are, whether there are sort of simultaneous works emergent at all times between all kinds of beholders and all kinds of possible works.
Right.
I'm just wondering if you would say more about the coexistence of many works and also about how they exist through and in time.
Well, it's interesting, right? What Gabriel argues is that in a way that kind of process is inexhaustible as long as there's an engagement with the work of art. Oh, Elena just disappeared. Where did she go?
I think she's still there.
Oh, she's there. She's in the middle now.
I just lowered my hand.
Oh, okay. So, no, ultimately, you know, a work of art can only exist if it is engaged with, right? Qua work of art. If it's just sitting there, like, you know, hidden, then nothing really happens there. And I'm still very much a delusion in the sense that I believe in the aesthetic encounter, qua encounter, as something that is an act of doing and making. So in that sense, you know, as long as there are people engaging with the work of art, it's timeless. If that makes sense, if that kind of responds like to part of your question. The other one is, of course, no encounter will ever be the same as the next. So even this work that I've been like thinking about for a long time now and looking at for many times, every time I look at these images of the works, even then, if it's not the actual works themselves, something happens. Because I allow it to happen, obviously, you know, it's like you have to be able to allow yourself to be affected by the work of art in order for it to work. Otherwise, you just kind of walk by it, and which I do often. You know, you go to the DIA and there kind of work that you're not particularly interested in that moment, you just don't engage with it. So that active engagement is a precondition for the aesthetic act to happen, I think. And that is kind of both time dependent, but also timeless, because as long as people will engage with the work of art, that work of art will continue to do its own work, its own labor. Does that answer your question, or is that too vague?
No, I think it does. I just all of a then it makes me wonder if it's at times there and at other times not there. In terms of presence, when you walk by it in the DIA, are there times when it disappears essentially?
Well, if you want to think about art in terms of the aesthetic act, it requires a beholder, right? And even though it exists as an object, for a work of art, it only works when there's a beholder to engage with it. That's basically that's actually what Harmon argues as well, right? Without a beholder, there is no work of art. It's an object. There remains an object. That holds true for all kinds of objects, but what makes the encounter with a work of art different from a encounter with like my doorbell, which I hear, or my water bottle here on this table, is that there's another kind of investment in it, in that the work of art has work to do itself, because there is, you know, this convergence of its materiality, but also its composition, which is non-material, and the idea it expresses, or ideas it expresses. So I think you need imagination for that aesthetic act to actually happen. So if I bring my water bottle in confrontation with a painting, I don't think much will happen. Unless I'm really underestimating my water bottle, but I don't think that is true. Maybe my water bottle has all kinds of capacities that I'm not aware of. I don't know. But you know what I'm saying? It is that tripartite, that kind of triangular operation that creates that allows for aesthetic effects to happen.
Thank you.
Todd, did you have a question?
Well, a weak question that might be or might not be relevant, but the last question made me remember that I know you've been reading Bergson recently, and how far away is that from your thinking?
It's not that far away. Actually, I wrote a book chapter over the summer, which, to my surprise, became like very much Bergson oriented and influenced. It's like you start reading something, you find ideas, right? That kind of like somehow resonate with what you're trying to think. I think Bergson's like pragmatism, if I can call it that, is very kind of relevant to what I'm trying to think here, in the sense that it is a being in the world, you know, that is kind of constantly happening, right? There is like no question that I'm not being in the world, even when I'm sleeping, like, you know, or like when I'm dreaming. What I like about Gabriel's model is that he talks about fields of sense in which two objects, or like me and another object, kind of exist in the same space, so that they are overlapping realities in which a convergence may happen. It need not, right? It's kind of similar to signs not necessarily signifying. I mean, a sign need not signify, but it may. And it's always possible that it will, and it will by convention, it will through, you know, long use. But I think what I like about Bergson in a sense is the sense of ongoing experience that I can never really predict. I mean, I can imagine I'm going to a dinner party tonight, this evening. This is what he uses, right, in his book. Which one is it? I read 3 this summer. I forget which one it is. That he can have all these kind of ideas about who will be there, what the conversation will be about, what people will be dressed like, and all these things. And then he says, and everything will be different because I cannot predict this. This is this ongoing kind of newly emerging forms of life that are ultimately unpredictable, however much I may have an idea about what to expect from something, and I will encounter myself in that new world at every single moment as well. I find that a very fascinating one, which kind of segues back to kind of looking at a work of art multiple times, that you never look in the same way twice, because you may have been reading something else, you have been looking at other art, you have like maybe have been deprived of looking at art for a long time, and all of a sudden you really need to look at art. That experience will be different from one moment to the next, and that even in this, on the part of the same subject, that you never look at the same thing twice, in a sense, because there's always this energy that is a potential part of that kind of interaction between the work of art and the beholder that creates something new. Does that make sense? I think Bergson is very helpful in that sense, when you think about looking at art, because it's unpredictable what will happen. And I don't know, I mean, a long time ago, before I even thought about writing about art, I had an experience which made me want to think about art. I was living in Amsterdam at the time, and I used to meet people for lunch at the Rijksmuseum, which is a luxury, which I now realize I'm living in Detroit. But I would run up the stairs and kind of see the Pink Finger Dawn by the Greig, which is kind of like was hanging like at the top of the stairs. And I'd seen that painting multiple times. And there was one day I was running late for my lunch date, and I walk up and I am confronted with that painting, and I burst into tears. And I'm like, what the fuck just happened? Why did this happen now? I mean, I've seen this painting so many times. All of a sudden, it was a different kind of encounter. I saw something in it, or it saw something in me. That made my whole experience kind of dramatically different from any other time that I'd seen it before. So that was really to go back to where you were, like kind of really one of the starting points why I wanted to write about art, because I didn't understand that. And I just wanted to kind of find a way to maybe not fully understand, but at least be able to write about it in a certain way, to think about it in a certain way that gives me some pleasure. And I probably will never understand it, but this is what the writing is for.
I see that
Thank you.
Lisa has a question, and we'll go over here to Melba.
Hi, Lisa.
Hey, great to see you. And thank you so much for introducing me to these artworks. They're just so beautiful and eerie and evocative. And I'm looking forward to seeing them in person.
Interrupt you for 1 second. I'm very pleased to say that the artist is actually here. She is like in the bottom of our screen. Hello, Cynthia. Glad to see you here.
Wow. Wow.
It's always awkward for me to talk about work when the artist is present, but I hope that she's okay with that. Anyway, go ahead, Lisa.
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah, and thanks too for bringing us along in your journey and thinking about this. That was fascinating. So my question is about, and I hope this isn't too banal, but I'm curious about the role that the medium or technology plays in your thinking about this, because certainly, like, the artist has highlighted certain features of that wall that make it more landscape-like, but what they can do is limited and shaped by the affordances of the medium or the technology that's being used. So how does that fit into your thinking?
For one part, I mean, I started thinking about this work, kind of grappling. As you know, I'm writing this book about photography, and have to think about like what the introduction of the digital, which has by some been bemoaned as the end of photography per se, and others have actually used to kind of actually what I think these images do is to create a form of visuality that where none was before, and that is only possible through the digital technology. And I think just for that reason alone, the work asks questions about the photographic medium, analog or digital, about like, okay, how does that medium work? If there's something that can be made to be seen that wasn't visible before, then how does analog photography kind of do something like that or not? Because as you know, analog photography has been haunted by the kind of referential, the kind of indexical kind of like function that it's supposed to have, right? That it always photographs something that was there in the world at some point. What I think what Cynthia's work does is to actually create a new kind of visuality where none was before, and it is made possible by the digital transformation of the art space, right? By being able to erase these kind of works from the walls of them, and then still give the walls the same kind of like white density that gallery walls naturally have, but also to actually see things that nobody would ever have found worthy to take photographs of, right? And then actually create new visibilities and deep landscapes that do not exist per se as such. They are not represented by the photograph. They're actually invented by the photograph. They're kind of created by the photograph. And I think the digital is kind of retroactively kind of asking questions about the medium of photography per se. And that's basically the kind of overall impetus behind the book on the other side of nowhere, to really kind of rethink photography in the light of the digital turn, and see what kinds of questions the digital forces us to ask of the medium of photography per se, whether analog or digital. So I think what these photographs do is to create visuality, not just make things visible, but to create a kind of visuality where none was before. And I find that very fascinating about the digital technology used here. Does that answer your question a little bit?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I'm glad you're thinking about that. And I look forward to, hearing more of your ideas. I'm just thinking though, too, of how the, whatever equipment is being used, whatever methods, like those are agential too, right? They are actively shaping what can be
Absolutely.
seen.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
So-
outside of what the artist does, what outside of what the observer can see, I mean, that's another
No,
object.
no,
Yeah.
that's precisely what I'm arguing, that the digital is making us think things about photography as a whole, because it can do different things than what analog photography can do. If that makes sense.
All right, thanks, Renee.
Thank you.
We'll go back into the room here.
Okay, I just wanted to share something with you that I've had a number of occasions where I've written poetry in response to painting. And the interaction is very obviously very subjective, but at the same time there has to be some kind of consideration for what I'm perceiving is going on, abstractly in the art itself.
Right.
And it's a real challenge, because I'm pretty sure that what I am interpreting in poetic language is what but other people will respond, differently. And I think that's sort of what you're saying every time you enter it. But it's not unusual that this happens often.
Right.
The two different art forms will come together, and there's an interest in that for some reason. And also I engage my daughter, she's a visual artist, and she has engaged my poetry and interpretations, and we collaborated on broadsides and things like that. So I just wanted to comment, on that, and it depends. And every art form is certain. Sometimes it's more narrative, sometimes it's very abstract.
Right.
Like Ed Clark, I did one for the BIA on Ed Clark, and it was a leap.
Right.
But I just wanted to share that with you, because I do think, and even with photography, because I studied photography for a limited extent, because I thought it would also enhance my poetic eye.
Right.
So I do think that there's so much overlap, and would also offer space for imagination and creativity.
Well, there's so many different ways in which one can relate to a work of art of any nature, right? And like whether one wants to write like in a theoretical vein about it, or in a more poetic vein, or actually kind of respond with images. There's so many different ways in which we can give expression to a kind of experience that is in a way unique because it only happens once, right? Because you can't look at the same painting twice in exactly the same way, or read the same poem in exactly the same way. I'm teaching poetry this semester when like, I'm always surprised. I'm like, oh God, I never thought about the poem this way, because there's always, something that somehow didn't reach me in the same way or didn't affect me in the same way. But I think the relationship between poetry and visual art is a very interesting one. I was thinking about Auden's poem about the Beaux-Arts Museum, which is I just taught. And, the ways in which that painting comes alive in a very different way and becomes a very different kind of thing that you kind of just look at it and think, oh, okay, here's Icarus kind of falling to his death. But then the poem itself raises so many questions qua work of art itself, right? So it's like this endless kind of, but it's like, I think Gabriel's notion of fields of sense just then makes sense because it is the poet who finds himself in the same field of sense where the artwork exists. And then we find ourselves in the kind of same field of sense where the artwork and the poem exist. And then, there is this whole kind of circuit of relations that are active relations and then they're not passive, right? I mean, there's always some kind of process that is productive going on there on condition that one engages, right? I mean, it doesn't happen just, when you just walk by a painting and you don't even pay attention to it, nothing happens. But if you're willing to engage, then that engagement can take so many multiple forms, but also create so many different layers of aesthetic activity at the same time, which I find fascinating. And thank you for sharing that.
I think that was a great question, because actually when you're talking about Auden's responding to a painting that is responding to Ovid, right? Who is responding to all those people who wrote myths before him.
Right.
And so, that it's part of it is, all that signifying energy just kind of builds up like a static charge.
Right,
isn't
it's
it?
cumulative too.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
No,
That's
it's
a lovely
really
example.
fascinating.
Can I just interject that when I do introductory to creative writing, in the first 2 weeks we do the Royal painting and we do the Autumn poem.
Beautiful.
And
Gotta add an Ovid.
and we evoke Ovid, absolutely.
Okay.
And then you can also add Carlos Williams did another poem about the fall of Icarus, that particular painting. So then you can see two poets responding to it.
But it's kind of interesting that one painting can evoke,
Sure.
so much kind of aesthetic energy, and that it will continue to engage us, right? I'm glad you're teaching that, because my students found it a little bit difficult, but
It is difficult.
it was fun to do, right?
There'd be no joy in it if it were not difficult.
That's right.
I know, I tell them that. I tell them you're wasting your money and your time if you're not getting a difficult class. Insist on a difficult class, but they don't always agree with you.
Other questions?
First of all, thank you for your presentation, and provocative as always. I expect nothing less from you.
Thank you.
You delivered. And in particular, the phrase that keeps calling out to me, I'm going to be using it, about the work calling forth the viewer.
Right.
And the kind of phenomenological aspect to that, right? And then your later statement that, digital photography is causing us to rethink the condition of photography and, new aspects of visuality. And I'm kind of wondering where you see a broader historical view in there, because, Piranesi's invention of perspective calls forth a new visuality.
Right.
Jackson Pollock's Lavender Mist calls forth a new visuality.
Right.
And I'm wondering how much of this, thinking is coming out of a historical context, specifically with respect to minimalism.
Right.
And the reason I'm really kind of zeroing in on this is Robert Irwin just died recently. And, there has always been a misperception about his work that it's about light, when in fact it's about perception.
Right.
And Jonathan Crary, in his new book of essays, is really delving a lot into this. And so I'm just kind of wondering how we might apply what you're talking about here to works of art that were never created with these kinds of intentions in place. I mean, a Gothic altarpiece was, an object of adoration
Right.
And how do we see it now in a contemporary space?
Right. No, I think that would be a great study, to write for you to write.
Right.
That would be a great study for you to write, because my focus really is here on, the photographic condition that we live in, that we inhabit. And, so the book is called The Other Side of Nowhere, Contemporary Photography as Practice of Life. So I want to really think about the ways in which contemporary photography kind of shapes our lives, but also informs how we see, how we feel. And so there are like 5 different chapters, 5 different bodies of work and different genres. One is Polaroids, one is digital,
Yeah.
one is analog, then there's one is black and white portrait photography, but then with queer subjects. So like really kind of preserving the kind of privileged space. And then one chapter is about street photography in Detroit. And so it sounds like it's not quite arbitrary. I mean, when I wrote my book proposal, I said like, okay, why these 5 artists, why these 5 bodies of work? And ultimately I said they just came to me. I mean, they stood out to me, and I can't ultimately explain why these 5, but I knew that these 5 were kind of like works and, kind of artists, and whose work really kind of stood out to me as something I wanted to think more about.
Yeah.
And I think, a historical perspective, yes, every new technology will create a new form of art and new modes of perception. That is just kind of like, that we are wearing on our faces today is kind of also a technology that allows us to perceive the world in a different way because we can see sharply. And yeah, new modes of seeing, when you think about, visualization technologies in the medical world today, like we can see things that we'll never be able to see before. So there are creations of an imaginative leap, right? That somebody kind of decided, okay, we're gonna kind of figure out to create a technology so we can see things that we cannot see. We can start with a microscope as a very, simple example, mechanical example from modernist times, but we can think about these amazing visualization technologies that are completely virtual, right? I mean, I'm always kind of astonished about these kind of surgeries that happen when people are basically looking at a completely virtual image, meanwhile risking somebody's life, right?
Right, yeah.
I find that totally fascinating, but that in the medical profession, those technologies have now been completely accepted as real, right? Even though they're fundamentally virtual, the virtual imaging technologies. And I find that, there's always a moment, and I do think this is why I call it photographic condition, and we're living like, beyond the postmodern condition that we've left behind, that photography in this day and age kind of plays a different kind of role in how we live and how we see and how we experience ourselves. And even, maybe 40 years ago or 30 years ago, I think the digital really did change, is a digital revolution that changed the ways in which photography work, apart from the fact that we now all take photographs all the time. That photography has become such a kind of common aspect of our everyday lives that we take photographs of everything. And that we can delete them and adjust them, and so, but that's really why I kind of am interested in this project, why this came to me, because of the particular historical moment. So it is very historically based, if that answers your question.
It does. And I guess I'm gonna have to take up the challenge. And I am persuaded, I wonder, just one more, I know we're out of time, about, some of what you're talking about, to me, seems to depend on the digital projection versus the digital print, right? That if you're projecting a slide, right, it's a reflection off the wall, whereas the digital projection is actually constructing the image.
Right, but the digital print is also a different print than the analog print.
Agreed.
Like the image is different.
I'm just saying that this particular reflection, you will, for
Yeah.
today is dependent on it being projected, not printed.
Well, when you see these kind of photographs, like, framed and everything, you really think that you're looking at landscape.
Yeah,
because
I've
they look
seen them.
like-
I'm familiar with Cynthia.
They look
work.
like
It's great. I
paintings,
love it.
right? Yeah. They look like paintings, and it takes quite a while before you realize, wait, this is not a painting. This is, so all your expectations, like conventional kind of
Yeah.
framing, hanging from gallery walls, where you just expect kind of to encounter certain kind of as soon as there's a certain tactility in it, you kind of expect it to be painting, and then you realize, oh no, they're photographs. So I do think that that's an extra layer, really, that kind of like confuses the field of perception. If that makes sense.
We read Benjamin's essay in class yesterday.
Oh, you did?
So this is an interesting, because I've got to go back to the students now and say, wait a second, we have to rethink some.
Rethink some of the ideas, yeah.
All right, well, time is up, so I'd like
Okay.
to, we can continue these conversations. I'd like
Thanks
to
everybody
thank,
for coming out.
Hoogland one more time for this fascinating talk.
Thank you.